Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 39, The Long Death of Quaker Rule. Over the last two episodes, we've discussed the history of Pennsylvania from the 1680s to the 1730s. Politically, the main struggle was over local autonomy. Pennsylvania was a proprietary colony ruled by one man, William Penn, and then later by his heirs. Thanks to various legal troubles, Penn had to spend most of his time in England instead of in America. In his absence, the Assembly slowly but surely accumulated power until they were the dominant force within the colony. In fact, in 1701, the Assembly forced Penn to accept a new constitution, which made Pennsylvania unicameral. The Assembly became the sole legislative body, while the Council was reduced to a mere group of advisors. But just as important as these political changes were the demographic changes reshaping Pennsylvania across the 18th century. Pennsylvania had been founded as a refuge for persecuted Quakers, and in the beginning, Quakers and other similar denominations did in fact dominate the colony. But there weren't actually that many Quakers in the world, and so the initial wave of Quaker migration soon dried up. However, that didn't mean that immigration stopped. Pennsylvania was a prosperous, tolerant place, and so many non-Quakers started coming. By the early 1700s, the Quakers were already a minority in their own colony. Some of these immigrants were Scots-Irish, fleeing the poverty of Scotland and Northern Ireland. The Scots-Irish in particular had almost nothing in common with the Quakers. They were rowdy, violent, and poor. I'll talk much more about them next time. And I've already discussed the Anglicans living in Philadelphia, plus other cosmopolitan men like Ben Franklin. The other big group came from Germany. Germany was still recovering from the devastation of the 30 Years' War several decades ago, and therefore migration was an enticing prospect. And once they started coming, they didn't stop. By 1717, there were some 15,000 to 20,000 Germans in Pennsylvania. By the Revolution, there were 110,000. When it came to politics, these Germans tended to support the Quakers for a few reasons. Firstly, many of the Germans also came from pacifist religious denominations, and even those Germans who weren't pacifists wanted to avoid war. Secondly, the Germans, being foreigners, were unlikely to run for office themselves, so it made sense to pick a group of native English candidates to support. And the Quakers, for their part, advocated giving the Germans citizenship as soon as possible so that they could vote for Quaker candidates. In order to maintain their power, the Quakers also made sure that the settlements on the western frontier, which were typically filled with non-Quakers, were systematically underrepresented in the Assembly. For example, in 1760, the eastern counties of Philadelphia, Bucks, and Chester had a combined 26 delegates out of 36 total, while the 5 western counties together had only the remaining 10 representatives, despite the fact that both regions had similar populations. So thanks to these sorts of tactics, the Quakers managed to stay in power much longer than you might expect, considering their small numbers. For example, in 1739, 22 out of 36 seats in the Assembly were still held by Quakers. But it would have been clear to everyone that things were changing. In order to keep that power, the Quakers had to stick together, so no more middling versus elite Quakers. From now on, there would just be a single Quaker faction. And when I say Quaker faction, I mean Quaker faction. They may have gotten support from other groups, but it was very much controlled by the Quakers themselves. By the 1750s, they were literally choosing their candidates during Quaker meetings. You might recall that Quakers governed themselves through a series of meetings, local meetings, regional meetings, meetings for men, meetings for women, and so on. Well, it was at some of these meetings that the Quakers chose their candidates. It's a bit like if today Republican Party candidates were being chosen explicitly by meetings of evangelical Christian leaders. Their opponents found this outrageous, and they issued calls for nominees to be chosen in public rather than private, but the Quakers ignored them. Who were these opponents? Well, the Quakers had continued to attack proprietary authority, and so their opponents wound up becoming supporters of the proprietorship. So once again, the factions were simultaneously split along lines of religion and politics. Quakerism overlapped with anti-proprietary beliefs, while non-Quakerism overlapped with pro-proprietary beliefs by default. However, the proprietary faction was generally on the losing side of things. The Quakers had assembled a powerful coalition, their policies were popular, and frankly the Penn family wasn't much of a help. William Penn had died in 1718, but it took a long time for his estate to be settled. The legal proceedings dragged on for most of a decade. I'll spare you all the details, but basically in the end, Pennsylvania went to his children by his second wife, Hannah, who herself died just after the court case was settled. It took a few years longer to decide who was going to actually govern the colony, but in practice it was her son Thomas who wound up running things. Thomas spent some time in Pennsylvania, but mostly he lived in England. He was a very different sort of man than his father. In fact, he wasn't even a Quaker. He didn't see Pennsylvania as a Quaker refuge or as some divine experiment. He had no grand visions for what life in Pennsylvania could or should be. To him, it was just an investment to be properly managed. In his words, quote, I never desired to have views so noble, extensive, and benevolent as my father, unless he had left a much larger fortune, because these views, though good in themselves, yet by possessing him too much, led him into inconveniences which I hope to avoid." End quote. No point in sticking to your beliefs so strongly you wind up in a debtor's prison. And the officials he appointed were generally non-Quakers as well. So those are the dividing lines within Pennsylvania: anti-proprietary Quakers, supported in particular by the Germans, versus the non-Quaker proprietary faction. It's remarkable how the government of Pennsylvania had now become anti-Quaker. This in the colony founded by William Penn, one of the most prominent Quakers in history. Just goes to show the weird twists history can take. By the way, this was also the time of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening had a moderate impact in Pennsylvania, less than in New England but more than in New York. The Quakers and Germans proved mostly immune to the Awakening's charms, but other groups such as the Anglicans were more receptive. Therefore, members of the Quaker faction tended to oppose the Awakening, while members of the proprietary faction tended to support it, but I don't think that it actually proved to be a major source of division like in New England. Pennsylvania just wasn't theocratic in the same way that Massachusetts was. But, moving along, the 1730s were a time of transition. Many of the old politicians who had led Pennsylvania for the last half-century, David Lloyd, James Logan, were either dead or nearing retirement, and a new generation of politicians was rising to take their place. Benjamin Franklin, for one, although he was kind of an outlier. He was from Boston, and he was a self-made man. Most leaders came from the new Quaker upper class, which I mentioned last time. Take, for example, William Allen, a leader of the proprietary faction. Allen had a somewhat successful merchant father, and Allen himself became one of the richest men in Pennsylvania. He married the daughter of a prominent politician, and in the 1760s one of his daughters married into the Penn family. He became a member of the council at age 23 and was elected to the assembly at age 27, then as mayor of Philadelphia at age 31. The same sort of career path as Thomas Hutchinson in Massachusetts. Men from prominent merchant families going into politics at a young age and marrying women from other such families. So all in all, that's the pattern Pennsylvania had settled into by the mid-1730s. But in the late 1730s, King George's War broke out, and once again Pennsylvania was called on to contribute to the war effort. The governor asked the assembly to raise funds, and at first the assembly, which was controlled by the Quaker faction, was open to the idea. During the previous wars, the Quakers had come up with a compromise. They'd raise money without explicitly specifying what it was for, even though in fact they knew it would be spent on fighting. That had been enough for the Quakers. They felt their hands were clean. Initially it seemed like that compromise would still hold. However, things were swiftly derailed. The governor began raising a volunteer militia, but when this militia took in a number of indentured servants without the permission of their masters, there was a general uproar in the colony. People thought that the militia, by taking in these servants, was stealing property from their masters. They soon turned against both the militia and against the war in general. Realistically, it may have just been an excuse to oppose the war effort, but either way the damage was done. The Quaker faction now opposed the war. There is one other factor to consider in understanding why this happened. The Quakers themselves were becoming more pacifist. You may recall that in New England there had been a gradual transformation of Puritanism as time went on, as the initial enthusiasm wore off. Something similar had happened within Quakerism. After 50 years in Pennsylvania, Quakerism had become less spiritual, less aggressive. All you had to do to be a Quaker was conform to Quaker practices, rather than accept the inner light. Quakerism was becoming normal. And just like in New England, this gradual loosening eventually provoked a backlash by people who wanted to recapture the old fervor and to maintain the Quaker identity against all the other immigrants in Pennsylvania. That meant taking their beliefs more seriously, including pacifism. And so many Quakers now found it harder to support war than in the past. They now wanted to be real pacifists, not just nominal pacifists. Of course, not all Quakers supported this change, but at the moment it was the hardline pacifists who had the upper hand. Whatever the reason, the Quaker faction was now at odds with the proprietorship. During the 1740 election, the proprietary faction argued that unless Pennsylvania agreed to help fund the war, some sort of catastrophe might overtake them. The Quakers, on the other hand, argued that war meant conscription, tyranny, and higher taxes. The people found that message more believable, and the Quakers won the election and kept control of the assembly. The proprietary faction was in a difficult position. They really had very little chance of winning the assembly, and without the assembly they couldn't hope to contribute to the war effort, which would undermine the Penn family in Britain. Remember, it was still possible that Parliament might make Pennsylvania into a royal province. That concern hadn't gone away. So if they couldn't win legitimately, the proprietary faction decided to use underhanded tactics instead. In the run-up to the 1741 election, they tried to get the Board of Trade to ban Quakers from holding elective office during times of war. Needless to say, such a drastic action would have wiped out the Quakers as a political force, at least temporarily. However, the Board of Trade declined to go along with the plan, which is probably sensible of them. Banning Quakers altogether sounds a bit harebrained to me. Although I should point out that it wasn't only the proprietary faction using underhanded tactics. For example, for several years the Quakers had been physically interfering with the election process in Philadelphia. As it happened, voters in the capital had to go up a flight of stairs in order to hand in their ballots. The Quakers had recently begun using this quirk to their advantage. They would all crowd along the stairwell and only allow voters who supported them to come up to vote. Everyone else they tried to block. Anyway, during that next election in 1741, things got a bit heated. When some reverend was accused of casting 2 ballots, someone punched him, and when an official moved in to break up the fighting, he got punched too. The Quakers won yet again, but that little scuffle was nothing compared to what happened in the next election in 1742. Having failed to oust the Quakers through legitimate or semi-legitimate means, the proprietary faction began considering more drastic actions. But first I need to explain a bit more about how elections in Philadelphia worked at this time. There were actually 2 elections on Election Day. The second election was for the delegates to the Assembly, but the first election was for the inspectors. The inspectors were the people who oversaw the election. They were empowered to look at people's ballots, to decide what was and wasn't legal, to disqualify people from voting, and so on. So controlling the inspectors meant that you could control the election process. It was a lot like the sheriffs in New York I talked about a few episodes ago. If you wanted to manipulate the elections, the inspectors were the way to go. Or if you feared your opponents were going to manipulate the elections, you wanted to make sure that they didn't control the inspectors. How were the inspectors chosen? By election, of course. But since there would be no inspectors to oversee their own election, this had to be done through a different process, overseen by the sheriffs. Instead of using ballots, voters would simply line up behind their preferred candidate to be counted. I suppose the idea was to make the election as public as possible so that there could be no trickery. And then, after the inspectors were chosen, the real election would be held. However, this system may have had some flaws. For one thing, the elections in Philadelphia were held near the docks, in an area filled with taverns and drunken sailors. It was an unstable environment. There were no orderly procedures, just big crowds of people milling around. It was an even more volatile area than that stairwell, even more vulnerable to disruptions. And before the election, there were rumors swirling through the city. Firstly, that the Quakers would bring in German immigrants to vote illegally. And secondly, that the proprietary faction had hired sailors to act as muscle to intimidate the Quakers out of voting. Everyone was on edge. Everyone was expecting trouble. On the morning of October 1st, everyone gathered to vote. Tensions were indeed high. There were an unusual number of sailors on the streets, already getting drunk and making threats to, quote, knock down the broadbrims, that is, attack the Quakers. The Quakers wanted these sailors to be removed from the area, but since they hadn't actually done anything yet, the officials overseeing the election refused. And even before the election began, already a few punches had been thrown. At 10 a.m., the polls opened and the voters began lining up to choose the inspectors. It soon became clear that the Quakers were set to win. Then suddenly 50-plus sailors appeared a block away, marching towards the voters. They began beating the voters with clubs, attempting to drive them away from the polling site. The voters were pushed back at first, but the sheriffs handed out clubs to any of the voters who were willing to fight back. Even a number of Quakers entered the fray. Thus there was a violent back and forth, and there were a few serious injuries. At one point the Quakers were pushed into the courthouse, and the sailors besieged the building. Windows were broken in, and so on. But eventually these sailors were driven back, and the rest of the election could be held in peace. 54 of these sailors were thrown in jail. It took pacifist Quakers arming themselves, but in the end they prevailed. Needless to say, the Quaker faction won big time, both in the elections for inspector and in the elections for the Assembly. And it wasn't just a one-time victory. The attack cost the proprietary faction dearly. The voters now associated them with violence and disorder, and with unfair elections. Although, to be fair, the accusations against the proprietary faction were never actually proven. The Assembly led an investigation into the incident, but the investigation was biased and partisan. They were aiming to make the proprietors look bad, not figure out what happened. It's possible that what happened was that the Quakers, fearing an attack, had tried to kick these sailors out of the area, which upset the sailors and led them to attack on their own initiative. Possible at least, though I think not likely. I would wager that the proprietary faction, or at least someone within the proprietary faction, was responsible. After all, we've seen these tactics before in 1690s New York, when Governor Fletcher had brought in sailors to intimidate voters, although in that instance the sailors didn't actually attack anyone. But in any case, now the Quakers were even more firmly in control of the assembly than before. For a while they controlled practically every seat, and the proprietary faction now had no hope of taking over themselves. They hardly even bothered to run candidates. So the governor now had to negotiate with the anti-proprietary faction from a position of weakness. The proprietary faction capitulated on a number of issues, but the Quaker faction gave in on military appropriations as well. They agreed to go back to the old compromise of granting money without explicitly stating what it was going to be spent on. However, although the Assembly was willing to spend money to other colonies to help them fight, they were much less interested in creating any sort of army or militia to defend Pennsylvania. In fact, the colony was nearly defenseless, as was shown when a French warship sailed up the Delaware and harassed some English vessels before sailing away. Rumors spread that an even bigger invasion was planned, but still the Assembly refused to create a militia. That gave an opening to Benjamin Franklin. He was always eager to form new institutions, and so he decided to create a volunteer militia himself. He wrote and published a pamphlet to that effect, and it was immediately successful. Thanks to Franklin's efforts, many men across the colony organized themselves into regiments and began drilling. Like many American militias at this time, the officers were elected. Specifically, the volunteers elected their officers, and then those officers elected colonels. Franklin could have been elected to lead the Philadelphia militia, but he declined the offer, instead serving as a common soldier, though all he ever did was keep watch. And in any case, the war ended that next year. Still, Franklin's efforts further increased his standing, at least among most Pennsylvanians. The more extreme Quakers weren't fans of the militia, but the moderates were happy enough to see someone else take up the burden. According to Franklin, quote, "Indeed, I had some cause to believe that the defense of the country was not disagreeable to any of them, provided they were not required to assist in it." End quote. On the other hand, if many Quakers proved unexpectedly grateful, the proprietary faction was rather lukewarm. They weren't too happy that Franklin had succeeded where they had failed. It was partly due to jealousy and to concerns over how ambitious Franklin was. Thomas Penn, the proprietor, was particularly wary of Franklin. He saw him as an agitator. Quote, "He is a dangerous man, and I should be very glad he inhabited any other country, as I believe him of a very uneasy spirit. However, as he is a sort of tribune of the people, he must be treated with regard." End quote. So strangely enough, by creating a militia, Franklin endeared himself more to the faction that opposed a militia than to the one that supported it. Although Franklin did remain friendly with both sides, it wasn't like he had firmly sided with one camp or the other, and his efforts were popular with the people as a whole. It was around this time that Franklin retired as a printer. He'd amassed enough money that he could now just pursue his personal interests, whether politics or science or inventions or founding new institutions. And though he was a dilettante, he did make genuine contributions. He helped advance the study of electricity, plus he invented the lightning rod, bifocal lenses, and a new type of stove. I have to say his reputation was earned. It wasn't merely inflated later on because of his role in the American Revolution. He was an impressive guy. Politically, he became an alderman in Philadelphia, and then he was elected to the Assembly, where he served from 1751 to 1764. Although, according to him, he didn't seek office on his own, though he was happy to accept it. Quote, "I would not, however, insinuate that my ambition was not flattered by all these promotions. It certainly was, for considering my low beginning, they were great things to me, and they were still more pleasing as being so many spontaneous testimonies of the public good opinion, and by me entirely unsolicited." End quote. In his first years in office, Franklin didn't join with the Quakers or with the proprietary faction. He remained nonpartisan, and he was able to work with men from both sides. He spent his time on various useful projects, getting a hospital built, getting the streets paved, and so on. Perhaps less admirably, he also worked to reduce the influence of the Germans within Pennsylvania. Like many English-speaking Pennsylvanians at the time, Franklin harbored serious anti-German prejudice. He was concerned that the Germans might never assimilate to English ways of life. They could remain forever German, a foreign element in the body politic. Their pacifism worried him as well. In one essay he asked, quote, "Why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and, by herding together, establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them?" End quote. And the Germans did indeed purposefully separate themselves from their English-speaking neighbors. They lived in ethnic enclaves and kept speaking German rather than learning English. And they were politically passive. Franklin thought they were too ignorant of liberty to properly participate in government. They rarely voted, and when they did, they just supported the Quakers en masse. And so Franklin proposed measures to remedy the situation, to weaken the Germans politically and to encourage assimilation. According to the historian Theodore Thayer, he, quote, proposed in 1752 that all non-English speaking people should be barred from holding civil or military office. In addition, he held that a prohibition should be placed on the importation of German books, and that all German publications should be obliged to carry an English translation on each page, while deeds, bonds, and other legal documents should be in English only. Intermarriage, he thought, should be encouraged to break down the clannishness of the Germans, and a limitation or quota should be placed on German immigration. Furthermore, he recommended that English schools be established among the Germans to anglicize the younger generation. End quote. However, none of those plans really went anywhere. There were a few schools open, but they folded within a few years, since they were correctly seen as being politically motivated. And the proprietary faction kept trying to ban Germans from voting along with the Quakers, but that didn't happen either. The Germans did begin to assimilate around the time of the Revolution, but it was of their own accord, not because the government forced them to. Moving along, the main dispute after the end of King George's War was over paper money. The Assembly wanted to print more paper money, while the proprietor wanted the opposite. A very standard dispute. Thomas Penn sent governors to Pennsylvania with secret instructions to not approve any more money being printed. But the Assembly kept passing bills to that effect, which the governors had to veto over and over again, leading to a stalemate that lasted into the 1750s. The Assembly was aggrieved, not just that they couldn't get more money printed, but that Penn's instructions to his governor were kept private, meaning that they didn't know what they were negotiating with. One governor got so fed up that he resigned. His replacement was a man named Robert Hunter Morris, who was actually the son of Lewis Morris, one of the big landowners in New York, the guy who had been removed from the Supreme Court by Governor Cosby. He's not that important historically, but I bring him up because Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, relates an amusing anecdote about him which I'd like to share, which tells you something about how politics worked at the time. Quote, "In my journey to Boston this year, I met at New York with our new governor, Mr. Morris, just arrived there from England, with whom I had been before intimately acquainted. He brought a commission to supersede Mr. Hamilton, who, tired with the disputes his proprietary instructions subjected him to, had resigned. Mr. Morris asked me if I thought he must expect as uncomfortable an administration. I said, 'No, you may on the contrary have a very comfortable one, if you will only take care not to enter into any dispute with the Assembly.' 'My dear friend,' says he, pleasantly, 'how can you advise my avoiding disputes? You know I love disputing, it is one of my greatest pleasures. However, to show the regard I have for your counsel, I promise you I will, if possible, avoid them.' He had some reason for loving to dispute, being eloquent, an acute sophister, and therefore generally successful in argumentative conversation. He had been brought up to it from a boy, his father, as I have heard, accustoming his children to dispute with one another for his diversion while sitting at table after dinner. But I think the practice was not wise, for, in the course of my observation, these disputing, contradicting, and confuting people are generally unfortunate in their affairs. They get victory sometimes, but they never get goodwill, which would be of more use to them. We parted, he going to Philadelphia and I to Boston. In returning I met at New York with the votes of the Assembly, by which it appeared that, notwithstanding his promise to me, he and the House were already in high contention, and it was a continual battle between them as long as he retained the government. I had my share of it, for as soon as I got back to my seat in the Assembly I was put on every committee for answering his speeches and messages, and by the committees always desired to make the drafts. Our answers, as well as his messages, were often tart and sometimes indecently abusive, and as he knew I wrote for the Assembly, one might have imagined that, when we met, we could hardly avoid cutting throats, but he was so good-natured a man that no personal difference between him and me was occasioned by the contest, and we often dined together." End quote. So politics could get heated, but it didn't always get personal. It depended on the men involved. Anyway, as it happened, Morris was governor for the first 2 years of the French and Indian War, which is our next big topic of discussion. The previous wars with Quebec had generally been fought in the north, on the borders of New York and New England. But now a new theater was opening up, the Ohio Valley, which is the area surrounding the Ohio River. The Ohio runs west from western Pennsylvania into the Mississippi. So basically the area we're talking about is part of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. This territory was disputed between France and Britain. It was still mostly populated by Native Americans with a few British traders, but now the French were starting to move in. Who would control this region? Well, by 1754 it became apparent that the only way to settle this was through war. War was coming to Pennsylvania for real this time, or at least to the outskirts of Pennsylvania. But the Quaker faction and the governor remained at each other's throats over the money supply, and for that reason it was hard to raise funds for the war. The Assembly was trying to use their leverage to increase their power, increase the money supply, and force the governor to make his instructions public. Into this dispute stepped Ben Franklin. He came up with a workaround solution which involved the Assembly issuing loans to raise funds rather than printing money directly. He also proved extremely helpful in gathering supplies for the army of General Braddock, which was setting off to fight along the frontier. However, these were only temporary band-aids. Braddock's force was soon utterly defeated and Braddock himself killed, which left Pennsylvania even more dangerously exposed to attack than before. The Assembly voted to raise a further £50,000, but once again relations with the governor caused problems. This time the issue was property taxes. The Assembly had decided to raise the money by raising property taxes, but the bill they passed taxed land owned by the proprietor along with everyone else's land. Governor Morris had instructions to prevent the Penn family lands from ever being taxed, and so he vetoed the bill, declaring that, quote, all governors, whether hereditary or otherwise, are, from the nature of their office, exempt from the payment of taxes. On the contrary, revenues are generally given to them to support the honor and dignity of government, and to enable them to do the duties of their station, end quote. Obviously, to the average Pennsylvanian, the idea that they had to pay taxes while their leaders didn't was seen as flagrantly unjust, especially during a time of war. With opponents like that, it's no wonder the Quakers held on to power. Well, that was only one reason they held on to power. The Quaker faction was also changing internally. Changing so much, in fact, that within a few years it would hardly be a Quaker faction at all. You'll notice that the issue being fought over is not whether or not to fund these military expeditions, but over how that money was to be raised. The pacifist Quakers were slowly losing their grip on the Quaker faction. Their demands were more and more seen as impractical in a time of war, and they themselves were growing weary of politics, which meant that non-pacifists and indeed non-Quakers were now able to put themselves in positions of power. Most notably, after spending his first few years in the Assembly as a nonpartisan figure, Ben Franklin had moved into the Quaker faction. In fact, he swiftly became the leader of the Quaker faction despite being neither a Quaker nor a pacifist. He kept some of the old policies in place, in particular the attacks on proprietary authority. He still tried to get Governor Morris to accept that proprietary lands would have to be taxed the same as everyone else, but he was also much more open to the use of force. He proposed a bill to create a voluntary militia, based on the one he'd created during the last war, and it was passed with only a few dissenting Quaker votes. Indeed, Franklin himself was made an officer. He went out to the frontier and raised a force of 560 men. There he had several forts built, but he soon returned to Philadelphia to continue his work in the Assembly without ever seeing any action. But the point is that Franklin was moderating the more extreme Quaker demands for total pacifism to create a more moderate, broadly acceptable faction. It was such a big change that I'm going to start calling it the popular faction instead of the Quaker faction. It was a continuation of the old Quaker faction, but it no longer had much Quakerism in its DNA. Franklin's new faction was opposed to proprietary authority, and it was still pretty anti-war, but it was also willing to raise a militia and so on. That was the sort of compromise position which appealed to most Pennsylvanians. They didn't want to pay for big armies or risk conscription, but neither did they want to be defenseless. Hence, a volunteer militia made perfect sense. It was a platform designed to get support from a supermajority of Pennsylvanians. And at the same time Franklin was taking over the Quaker faction, the remaining Quakers were voluntarily removing themselves from power. The proprietary faction was still continuing its quest to bar Quakers and Germans from serving in the Assembly or voting. In 1755 they sent a petition to London asking the Board of Trade to keep these groups out of government. The Board of Trade heard the petition and issued a recommendation to Parliament that they pass an act requiring office holders in Pennsylvania to swear oaths, which of course Quakers were forbidden from doing. It was an indirect way to ban Quakers from office. In response to this, the Quakers in England mobilized to help their brethren in America. They worked on two fronts, firstly to keep officials in London from taking any drastic actions. And indeed, Parliament wound up not banning Quakers from office, although it was probably due to the fact that Pennsylvania was being more proactive in the war thanks to Ben Franklin, but either way the Quakers were saved for the time being. But the other thing that the English Quakers did was to discourage Pennsylvania Quakers from holding office during wartime. Maybe that seems contradictory. They were both working to make sure that Quakers could hold office and to make sure that Quakers didn't hold office. But I think it made sense. This way the Quakers wouldn't have to compromise their principles and they wouldn't take the blame for any problems that came up. It was better to voluntarily give up power for a little while rather than risk being permanently forced out. The Pennsylvania Quakers apparently agreed with this logic. 6 of the hardline pacifists resigned from the Assembly, and they were replaced by Anglican supporters of Franklin. And after the next election, another 4 Quakers resigned. By 1756, a majority of the Assembly was now non-Quaker, a tremendously rapid fall. But as it turned out, that was it for the Quakers. They never again regained control of Pennsylvania. Their numbers were too few and their total pacifism was too unacceptable. That they'd held on so long was a miracle itself, but Realistically, it couldn't last. As soon as they were dislodged, there was never any going back. And so the transformation of Pennsylvania was complete. The proprietorship had ceased to be Quaker with the death of William Penn, and now even the Quaker faction had ceased to be Quaker. 70 years was all they'd had. The Quaker experiment had failed, just like every other planned attempt to build a society in America. In New England, the Puritans, in the end, had abandoned their Puritanism in favor of creating a normal society. The Quakers, however, made the opposite choice. They held on to their beliefs even when it meant losing power. As society drifted away from the Quakers drifted away from society. Many Quakers were becoming increasingly apolitical. Well, not exactly apolitical, they still wanted to make the world a better place, but the compromises politicians had to make were unacceptable. And so the true believer Quakers became increasingly withdrawn from political life. Any of the Quakers who didn't support this turn drifted away from Quakerism in general, which reduced the Quakers to a small but devoted rump of true believers. Instead of politics, the remaining Quakers devoted themselves more and more to charity and to advocacy, which is one of the big reasons why the Quakers turned to abolitionism before almost anyone else in America. They redirected their energy into causes like that. And so the few remaining Quakers continued to have an outsized impact on America for generations to come. There's a saying, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I don't know if that's true, but it's what Quakerism aspires to. Pennsylvania was no longer Quaker, but Quakerism imprinted itself on America's identity far more than you'd think. Next episode, we'll finish off the history of colonial Pennsylvania with a comprehensive look at the one group of colonists I haven't yet talked about, the Scots-Irish, the Fighting Scots-Irish. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. The podcast is on Twitter, @EarlyOftenPod, or go to the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com for transcripts of every single episode. And if you like the podcast, give it a good review on iTunes. That helps. Thanks for listening.